Anyone prepared a paper?
I did it last week. I'm free to go.
I have a paper for you.
Thanks.
Hello.
Hello.
Hey.
Morning.
Welcome to Neuroccino at 9:30 on a Monday morning. Before I forget, I just wanted to announce that we have the CNS Nightcap next week, Wednesday, 9 p.m., which is not going to be live on YouTube, but on Zoom. So you're welcome to join for that one. And we're going to discuss Chat GPT, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So you're welcome to join for that. Today we have a presentation by Anna. Anna is a postdoc, a PhD still. Jumping ahead here.
Almost.
Almost. In the lab in Bordeaux, the BCB lab. And she has a paper for us today. I don't actually know which one. Can you share the link so we all have access to it?
Here's the link.
Fantastic. That was prepared.
I was prepared, of course, as always. As always.
Lovely. And if you want to take it away.
Yeah, I am taking it away. Thank you very much. And good morning, everyone. Somebody is joining our, oh, hello. All right, so can you see my screen, full screen? Cool. So the paper I prepared for today was just recently published on Friday by Shuai Gang and colleagues. And it's about intersecting distributed networks that support convergent linguistic functioning across different languages and bilinguals. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into decoding higher cognitive functions, such as language processing. And I thought it's quite interesting for a lot of us because for, I think, all of us here, English is the second language and we are somewhat bilingual. And also, I guess, or I believe a lot of followers of Neuroccino and CNS seminars are international. So I thought it could be interesting to look into how bilingual brains accomplish the process of more, of processing more than one language. So what they did here was that they looked into, into bilingualism and how it relates to either a common neural system for different languages, or whether there's basically one neural system, or there are several different neural systems and separate brain mechanisms that become specialized for each language. And here they focused more on somewhat fine-grained level of brain anatomy and the anatomical organization, and dived deeper into the assimilation-accommodation hypothesis and checked whether this one holds. So the assimilation-accommodation hypothesis is quite known about among linguists, and it basically says that there are brain neural networks that support the native language, which is known as the assimilation part, and then there are additional neural networks that support basically the second language, which is known as accommodation, and they are both utilized to implement the second language processing. So basically language one helps language two. And yeah, there have been quite a lot of studies on that as well, but not that fine-grained on the anatomical level like they did. And also here in the study, they used the representational similarity analysis, which we're going to dive deeper a little bit later. But an important other thing to mention is that the similarity of the brain neural networks that between the first and the second language is affected by different factors, such as, for example, the distance of acquisition of language one and language two. And so basically the age when it was learned, and also the proficiency. So this is going to be important a little bit later when we look into the limitation of the study, because I completely understand it's quite difficult to study bilinguals on a standardized in a standardized manner. So what they did here was looking more into the language processing representational components. So there are three to it. There is the orthographic, the phonological, and the semantic. So orthographic is basically how it's written, right? Phonological is how it sounds, and semantic is the meaning. And these are like same linguistic, they also have the same linguistic functions in different languages, and they're based on anatomically in identifiable regions. So this has been also studied. So that's why they, I guess, why they chose, those three components. And yeah, let's take a look how they did it and what they did. So they scanned Chinese English bilinguals, and the participants were just performing an implicit reading tasks, right? So this is the experimental trial. And the words they read were in English, in Chinese, and in Chinese pinyin, which is the basically the romanization system of a standard Mandarin Chinese. So writing letters, Chinese letters, or Chinese sounds using the Latin alphabet. And since the languages, English and Chinese are quite different, so they differ significantly in their visual spatial properties and orthographic rules and semantic access, they were perfect to study the different mechanisms that are involved into language processing. So what this is just the behavioral performance. So they had an accuracy rate and the reaction time of the participants seeing and reading Chinese, English, and Chinese pinyin words. There were no differences in the accuracy rate, but in the reaction times, English words took the longest, and there were significant differences. However, what they hypothesized was that they would find interleaved neural populations responding to the same linguistic components across languages. So the three linguistic components I just named, right? And that would reflect the accommodation of the language too. So the accommodation hypothesis of the second language. And meanwhile, they also thought that the same linguistic components would be processed within the same regions across languages, which would reflect the assimilation of language 2 based on language 1, so the first language. So what they found in the regard to the activation maps at the group level, can you see it full screen, or should I make it a little bit smaller? So now you probably can see the entire map. So what you can see here quite beautifully is that there are highly similar activation maps across the three languages, right? So you can see the Chinese word, English word, the Chinese pinyin, and the areas that are activated, these are especially the middle temporal gyrus, the fusiform areas, the middle occipital gyrus, and the middle frontal gyrus. And these were consistently activated under all conditions. So if we take a look at the third figure here, it shows the brain responses to linguistic components for the three language types. So with language types, they mean three different languages. I'm gonna zoom in a little bit more. And you can see that the brain responses to linguistic components are quite different. So it's quite scattered across the brain. What they also looked into, or put a lot of effort actually to standardize, or not standardize, but to explain more where the cognitive loads of different words. So this is quite an interesting graph, interesting figure showing the different cognitive loads in regard to the different languages and the different linguistic components. I know it can be quite confusing, but so we have three languages, three different linguistic components. And going further, let's take a look at figure 6, because I think this is the most interesting figure of the entire study. So it shows the brain representations for the three linguistic components of logography, which is again writing, phonology, and semantics. And here they also explored. So first of all, you can see again, the brain involvement maps of the 3 linguistic components for each language type. And here on the right side, again, the cognitive loads, which are quite, which are the same as in the first figure. But the interesting thing I want to focus on is the C and the D figure. So in C, they matched the regions with similar patterns and the percentage of cognitive loads for each linguistic component in Chinese and English words. So they skipped the Chinese pinyin. And you can see that the most brain regions here, they were involved in 2 or more language processing components, because it has all 3 colors, right? And all these regions, brain regions listed here, they are consistently involved in brain processing of the 3 linguistic components, independent of the language. So all of them work basically simultaneously. And in the figure D, 6D, you can see the regions with different patterns and percentage of cognitive loads for each of the linguistic components in Chinese and English words. So it's quite, interesting to go. They go in the discussion, they go into all the background and explanations about why and how. And it's also quite exciting, but beyond the scope a little bit. But so how they explain, which I thought is interesting, how they explain the different patterns in the percentage of cognitive loads is, especially in regions where they didn't really expect it, was that it could be perhaps because of the different demands of linguistic features. So another thing that they looked into, which was quite good and interesting, was that, so because they studied Chinese native speakers or Chinese English bilinguals, the age of acquisition might have affected the outcome. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, upon a reviewer's request, they divided the group into 2 and looked into at the differences between early age of acquisition and later age of acquisition, because also, as I mentioned earlier, the age of acquisition, the distance between the acquisition of the first and second language and the proficiency are the main factors for driving brain activation in regard of a language. So they divided the group in 2, and what was interesting here is that both early and late groups of acquisition, I'm just going to call them early and late from now on, showed intersecting neural populations underlying the processes or processing of the 3 languages. So it's again quite scattered, but if you compare now the Chinese word and English word to the Chinese pinyin, you can see that the early acquisition, so early here, late the second row, that the early acquisition age group showed similar brain load maps of linguistic components between the Chinese words and the English words, compared to the late age of acquisition group, that you can see they're more activated, like they're more more extensively activated brain regions for processing the language. But despite the despite the age of acquisition, the early and late one, the interactions for the cognitive loads remain the same as as when the 2 groups were together. So this kind of backs up the comparability of the study population, that it's basically it works. So the main outcome of the study I would say is that they observed regions that are spatially separated, right, to perform the same linguistic functions across languages. And this indicates that there is a functional assimilation on a region level that is supported by the anatomical accommodation. So the three linguistic components that they studied were basically co-represented within the most language-related cortical regions, but had separate neural populations, which is quite cool and exciting, and has never been done, I believe, on this scale before. And yeah, they also, so basically they also, because they found differences in the linguistic components that are involved in language processing, they also speak a little bit for the accommodation part of the theory for the language specific features. So they basically deliver arguments for the assimilation and for the accommodation part. And there is one really good summarizing sentence in the discussion that I can't find right now, but basically what they say is that they found that the language types could be correctly classified within the brain activity corresponding to all components, as well to every specific component as features in the classifications, which basically indicated that not only different linguistic components, but also the same component across different language systems would entail distinguished neutral populations which were adapted to their own linguistic features. And I have that as a note, but I can't find it here. I'm sorry. Yeah, and this also is supported by some like clinical data that, for example, after brain damage, one language or one function of one language can be impaired, but not the other one, which is like in bilingual individuals. So I would say that the main outcome is that broad brain cortical regions, while they're interdigitated, distributed neural populations, are supported or support the same cognitive components of different languages. And yeah, so I'd say that, or the authors say it actually, that they believe that these findings verify the functional independence of neural representations of different languages. And that's basically what they studied and what they found out. So happy to discuss.
Thank you, Anna. That was a speedy run through. I actually switched on closed caption for people to follow on YouTube.
I'm sorry,
for the button to slow you down.
I'm sorry. That's because the last time I went over time.
Plenty of time to discuss the paper, and based on the chat that was going on in the background, there is a lot of questions for you. So let's start with, I think Chris was first.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for the presentation. So were they bilingual people in the study that learned both languages very, very young? Because there is this, I've seen a bunch of studies and even like articles and videos about how different the brain of a native bilingual is compared to when we learn it later in life. Like also just the fact that they don't have an accent in both languages. But when we learn a language later, we always have an accent. Right. And I wanted, so yeah, do you know if they have native bilinguals in the study?
That's something, yeah, I wanted to talk about also regarding the limitations. So the only thing that they did was that I mentioned, they split the group up into 2 age ranges. So the age of acquisition of the language, which is also quite wide, right? Like 3 to until 8 and 9 until 15. It's well, if I start speaking a language, then I'm probably 3 years old, but then I would fall into the same group if I started learning English in school, right? In the 1st grade. So this is something that I was also quite bothered about. Well, as a limitation, we don't know. So they just
because what in the graphs we see that one component, well, 2 components are often significantly different in how they're processed in the brain. So it's weird that if native bilinguals have the same like problems, mechanical problems with English or with Chinese, that's a very interesting like if you can identify a mechanism that is always requiring more brain processing in the language, that's really interesting in terms of how we learn the language and also just the mechanics of the language for the brain. But I don't know if they can differentiate that with their study. That's the thing.
So what they do is actually they explain a lot of background, which I didn't, or I thought at least I don't have time for, to dive a little bit deeper into it. So they explain a lot of background about the English words, how they are processed, and also the writing, right? Like that, for example, if they see Chinese words, Chinese letters, because of the different alphabets, it's the access to the brain is different, if that makes sense. So it's not like we're letter for letter for letter that you or that the participants are thinking about how the letter sounds like, and that's how they construct the word in their head. But because Chinese letters, as far as I know, they are not letters but sounds, right? Like there's Victor might know better because he studied Chinese. This is just a different. There are different ways how these information access the brain. So
just basically in Chinese, each character is somewhat of a syllable usually.
Yes.
And it also has meaning inside, like written inside of it, that you can find a bit like etymology in Latin languages. They have it somewhat written inside the character. So there is both what you remember, how you pronounce it, and information about the meaning inside of how it's written.
Right. So it's quite different also because Chinese words consist mostly of 2 syllables, right? And I mean English words have like 5 to 9 syllables sometimes. So that might also be something that affects or drives the results. But like the main criticism here is, as you also said, is the proficiency of language. Because it makes a huge difference whether one of my parents speaks English with me and I grow up with it, or I learn it from, I don't know, age 7 in school. And I mean, that's something that they didn't define quite well. What is bilingualism, which I think is quite problematic as well, because are we now also all bilinguals, or like English and our native language bilinguals, or aren't we? Like, going off with their definition, we would be, but I would never consider myself as an English bilingual, for example. So yeah, quite problematic, but it's also super hard to find standardized a standardized way how to study bilinguals and then find a population for it as well. So here they studied 51 participants, which is also already quite good. But I believe, especially with Chinese and English bilingualism, that opens up so many ways because of the significant differences in the languages. to study so many different approaches or different things, how different reactions of the brain to it. It's quite hard, I believe. For example, if you would study Catalan and Spanish, which are quite similar, but still two different languages. So yeah, maybe something that would help for like the next study would be to acquire the level of proficiency of the language.
Yeah, definitely.
And to then group people by that and not by age of acquisition. But then again, age also drives the results. So what do you do? Where do you set the threshold?
Yeah, I would totally agree that it makes a difference how you define bilingualism, right? But technically we're all bilinguals because we're exposed to many languages on a daily basis nowadays. But then the proficiency does make a difference. So that would have been nice to have a measure of. Victor also has a question.
All right, I have two questions. One is related to the one we just discussed, is are the whole population they are studying actually Chinese who learn English?
Yes.
Yeah, so that is another bias, because
Yes.
it would have been much more interesting, I think, if they had half Chinese who learned English and half English natives who learned Chinese as at a bilingual level. That would have been like balancing a lot of effects, I think, which you don't have here. So that's too bad. But I mean, they do what they can with what they have. It's hard. I think it's really hard to get a large data set with without these kind of troubles. The other question I had was about the interdigitation of their activation in the brain. If I understand correctly, it's interdigitation at the group level, right? Because a problem with that is with the interindividual variability. What the few studies I've seen that do analysis of interdigitation of different paradigms, they use it at the individual level and then bring the interdigitation at the group level. But if you start to do it directly at the group level, you'll miss a lot of things and you may end up with misinterpretation of the data. So I'm a bit skeptical about that.
Right. So they did it in the group level, but they used this analysis where they first mapped out like different language activation maps in the brain. So the analysis was called RSA, so representational similarity analysis. I'm not sure whether this is something, because I don't know too much about it, but I'm not sure whether this method is something that could counterbalance it a little bit. So it's basically a method to check the brain responses to linguistic components during language processing in every language. And then they created those language maps where they identified which linguistic components are represented where anatomically in the brain. So maybe that's something that could also back up the back up that they put it all on a group level, and then but before that analyze those maps, knowing which activations are there for different components for different languages. So that's what Okay. But I understand the skepticism.
I mean, it's more than skepticism. Maybe they did something nice, and I just don't know the method they're using. I haven't read the articles, I can't say, and it's like technical details that are somewhat hard to really look for when you are not specifically looking for them. So yeah, I may have to look at it. Have a look at it. Thank you.
Final question goes to Michelle.
Are you talking to Moao? Famous bilingual man. All right. So I had a question. So they didn't assess really the communication between the brain regions. in the paper to just assess the difference in activation or pattern of activations. So maybe, you know, like difference in the way you process the information is not in the areas that are activated, but in the way they speak together.
Do you want to clarify a little bit?
So you can look at the activity of brain regions, see, but they didn't try to capture the interaction between the brain regions. In the
Okay,
paper.
yeah.
That's a question.
So that's the that's a question. Okay, I thought that's that's something you just looked into. Well, they did for different language types, right? So they looked at the co-activation of the language processing, the three language processing components, and then at the three language types. So is it something that you mean? So when you look at only when the participants looked or heard or read English words, then they looked into the three different linguistic components together.
Right. Where
Wouldn't it be something that
they didn't look at interaction between brain regions so far as I've seen.
Okay.
Presentation. So my question that is like, did you see it in the supplementary material? No.
No, I can't. I don't know. Can't answer that one.
It'll be so interesting to see, if they are like different there.
But what they really focused into was the cognitive load, and they really put a lot of effort to make cognitive load a main component to study. So they looked at cognitive load and then the three different languages and the three different linguistic components and how the cognitive load changes, for example. And there is, I'm not sharing my screen anymore, right? But there's basically this graph I didn't go into, unfortunately, but that looks at correlations of cognitive loads and and linguistic components. Maybe that's something that would indicate towards the towards different activations, basically in regard of different cognitive loads.
I see.
I'm
but
not sure whether this is something that you were talking about.
I'll read it.
Still not.
Like I see. I'll read it in I'll have a look.
Sorry, couldn't answer that one.
So one thing that I thought was interesting was that the main difference was really in parietal lobe areas, where we also see quite a bit of variability in the cortical, but also the white matter anatomy. So that I thought was quite an interesting finding that you presented. That was figure 6D, I believe, the areas that are the percentages with the areas that are similar and then the ones that are diverging, and the majority of the ones that are diverging were actually parietal lobe or parietal lobe adjacent areas, except for the fusiform. That's a bit further away. So I thought that was quite an interesting observation of the study. And then the divergent patterns for syntax or phonology, that is something that's already well established in the literature, that we know that these go far beyond the classical Perisylvian areas and that they differentially activate cortical areas. So that to me is not surprising, and that you see differences between the languages when they're quite differently in their concepts, i.e. more phonological or more orthographic, is again not too surprising, I would argue. Right. No more questions. In that case, thank you all for joining this morning. See you again next week. We have a volunteer already. Marsh is going to present next week. And again, we have the Neuroccino nightcap, sorry, not Neuroccino, CNS nightcap next Wednesday. So do join us for that. And I just wanted to throw in a little thank you because I was gifted a Neuroccino map by my students last week. So here's a shout out to Team Neuroimaging and thanks for the mug. Great. Have an exciting week in science and see you next week.